Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Friday, February 27th, a few days after our latest Roman spectacle, which for the past 2 decades I have declined to watch or in any way participate in. And of course, I'm talking about the State of the Union address. You know, everybody in this business feels the need to jump on and comment while the spectacle is unfolding with the standing and the sitting, and whoever's president, you know, whatever party has the guy in the White House, the other party won't clap for anything. And of course, I missed all that. Thank goodness. I was watching Battle for the Planet of the Apes, which I can assure you was much more edifying than anything you would have heard out of President Trump or any president for that matter, at least in my lifetime. So yeah, I missed it. But of course, as I've been doing for the last 2 decades, I did read the transcript the next day and was going to come on and share some thoughts with you then. And then I thought, you know, why bother? Really, this whole exercise with the State of the Union is just, it's some combination of religious, childish, garish. It's just completely awful from beginning to end. And again, it doesn't matter to me which party has the White House. I mean, they were just as bad with Obama in there, because he the last one. We had Biden, of course. Well, whoever wrote the speech for Biden was probably as horrified as I would be if I had watched it. Just watching Biden struggle through reading the words on the teleprompter. But, you know, one of the things that is so disturbing about the State of the Union is the messianic, I'm trying to think of a better word, you know, the Messiah. Every president talks as if by his, you know, very will, his fiat, that he can do anything. We're going to make prices come down. We're going to make, you know, jobs out of nothing. Everyone's going to have a job, a chicken in every pot, as they used to say when that was a big deal. Every kid's going to have a pony. Well, I don't know. It's kind of ludicrous. And the thing that really bothers me is that who's ever got the White House, who's ever candidate won the last time around, these people just can't help but gush over the ludicrous statements. And before we even get to Trump's delusional comments and assessment of the reality in the United States, I mean, just think, you know, back to Obama. I mean, he used to talk about lowering sea levels with his divine will. You know, when he talked like that, it always made me think of the song that they used to sing in church when I grew up in the 70s, you know, and they had the folk groups in mass. Put your hand in the hand of the man who calmed stilled the water. Something like that. That's Obama, right? He stilled the water. He calmed the sea. Put your hand in the hand of the man who calmed the sea. Anyway, so Trump, you know, made some comments. Here's the thing, too. This goes back to Jefferson. I mean, you know, by the way, he didn't make a speech. He wasn't a very good speaker. So he started the wonderful tradition of just writing down the State of the Union comments and sending it over to Congress. And that lasted until Woodrow Wilson. Of course, you know, Woodrow Wilson would be the one to resurrect the grand spectacle, right? But for what? Jefferson left he started that with his first inaugural in 1801. So that lasted 112 years until 1913, when Woodrow Wilson assumed the presidency. So what a wonderful 112 years to be without this embarrassing, frankly, just religious revival. I'm trying to think of the good word, you know, this nationwide worship of the almighty state. That is the State of the Union address. And of course, every president, once he gets to the State of the Union address, since I guess his first year, they don't even call it that. I guess they did this year because it wasn't Trump's first year in office. So I'm not sure if they actually are calling it the State of the Union or they address the message to Congress. But usually a new president, the first one he gives is not actually called the State of the Union. Bit of trivia for you there. But everyone, I think, informally calls it that. But what he does is he comes in and, I'm sorry, yeah, this would be Trump's second. So never mind that entire line of thought. He would have given some message last year and they call it something else. And I can't remember what. And then this year, this is the official State of the Union. And it's always great. If that president's been around for at least a year, it's the State of the Union couldn't be better. It's all due to him. Okay. It was terrible when the last guy was in here. We did everything different and now everything's great. Okay. So, and again, it's not just Trump. I mean, everybody says basically that. Trump like takes it to another level, because and it looks like the transcript that I read was actually a transcript of what he said. Because back in, 20 years ago, when you first were able to get these on the internet fast after the speech, I think you would get what they released in advance to the reporters. And so I used to have a press pass, believe it or not. And I used to get these things. And then they would what they call quarantine them, which meant that you were kind of on your honor not to release or say anything or disclose anything in the speech until after it was over. And they do this with a lot of things, not just the State of the Union speech and not just speeches, but you'll see like a quarantine. And then, that's like a kind of a honor code with the reporters not to disclose that. So anyway, you would get the speech. And of course, with Trump, because you can always tell when he's ad-libbing because he starts to sound like, a crazy man. And like, he said something, we're the hottest country in the world, right? And like, if somebody wrote that and Trump didn't ad-lib that from some other word, and I think they did write the word hottest into the speech to make it sound like Trump, but Trump will say, we're the hottest country in the world, the very hottest. Nobody ever thought we'd be this hot. He'll go on rambling for a while, like some guy who just got confused and doesn't, he got lost in the city or something. So, but the transcript looks like they actually now with AI and everything, they probably just, capture it verbatim because a lot of the rambling is in there. So anyway, so if you watch the speech, I mean, you can get the transcript. I'll post it on my show notes for this episode and you can compare it if you want. It really doesn't matter much. But I thought I would just pick out a few highlights. I don't want to fact check the speech because that's so, who cares? There's always the fact check and it's always much harsher when there's a Republican president because all the legacy media are Democrats. And now, of course, with the alternative media, if you go to the conservative alternative sites, it'll all be like the opposite, right? With a Democratic president, he's just lying every minute, and our guy's mostly telling the truth. And if you believe that one, but I wanted to show you a few things on this just to ground anyone who bought anything that the raving lunatic said during the State of the Union. I want to show you a few things. If you're listening, then these will be on the show notes page for anybody who wants to check them. If you're listening in the car, you get a chance, so you can go to the show notes and take a look. So one of the things that Trump took credit for, of course, was that inflation has gone down during his presidency and that prices are plummeting. Okay. So the first part of this that you have to understand is the inflation rate going down does not mean prices are going down. It means they're going up not as fast. Okay. So in order for prices to be going down, the inflation rate would have to be a negative number. And that's not happened. And not only are they not going down, they're not going down any faster than they were when Biden was president. In fact, the big spike happened while Biden was president, so he can take credit for reducing inflation from 10% to 2.7, 2.4, something like that. We'll look in a minute. But of course, first of all, inflation has nothing to do with the president. To the extent that he signs a big spending bill and there isn't enough tax money to pay for it, that can give a reason for inflation. But the word inflation, as I've said many times before, does not mean prices going up. It means increasing the supply of money and credit. And if, again, I'm right over in my desk to my right, or dresser, whatever you want, cabinet, you want to call it, I still have my 1999 Merriam-Webster paper dictionary, which I keep for very few reasons. And one of them is that the definition of inflation in my Merriam-Webster dictionary from the 20th century on paper can't be changed on the internet, still says that inflation is defined as the increase in the supply of money and credit. And then it says after, like, said to cause a rise in prices. Okay, so you could see what's happened, right? If you talk about George Orwell, nobody thinks that's the definition of inflation anymore. All right. Everybody thinks that inflation is rising prices, and they've been working on that for a long time. When I was a kid, they were talking about inflation as if rising prices were inflation. Way back when Carter was president and I was in grammar school, and Nixon as well. But every economist in the world would tell you, no, that's not really the definition back then. And even the dictionary, the Everyman Dictionary, the Merriam-Webster, would tell you that inflation is the increase in the supply of money and credit. So anyway, but I digressed, as I usually do. So Trump says that prices are plummeting. Okay, so I'm gonna show you a little chart here, and let's see if you can see that. I believe you can. All right, this is the consumer price index over the past, looks like 20 some years, right? Yeah, it's the past 20 years. And of course, this is what they call inflation, which is the rate prices are rising. Okay, and you can see that back in 2008, when we had that huge financial crisis, prices had been rising at a 5.5% rate, and they did go negative. Prices did fall from about December 2008 until October of 2009 or thereabouts. All this space where the CPI is below zero, to the extent the CPI is at all accurate, and there's all kinds of problems with that as well. Believe it or not, some libertarians, like Gene Epstein, for example, says that the CPI overstates price increases. So it's not uniform that everyone thinks it's lower, but there's lots of mechanisms in there to make prices look like they're not going up as much as they are. So anyway, you can go over the 20 years. We were down there where prices weren't going up again. In 2015, if you remember, we had that second recession right around here. So whenever we have a recession and demand for products and services falls, goods and services, products, you could have prices not go up regardless of the money supply, because people just aren't buying things and markets have to clear. Vendors cut their prices to get rid of what they have. Okay, anyway, so as you can see, we had another CPI touching the zero line, 0.1% in May of 2020, right after the COVID lockdowns occurred. And then what happened? Prices went again, this is the price increase. So prices started increasing faster and faster during 2021. Now notice, by the way, this started before Biden took office. Okay. And then he takes office in January 2021. That's where the cursor is right now. And prices immediately start shooting up. Now, if you believe that this is because of something Joe Biden did, who's barely aware of his surroundings or even his administration, I mean, come on. Okay. But why did prices start increasing so fast right after the COVID lockdown? Because these lockdowns lasted all through this year, but prices were going up. And then they really took off at the beginning of 2021. Why is that? Well, it's not because of directly any policy of the president's. Although when they sign big spending bills that we don't have the money for, how do we pay for them? I shouldn't say we. This is how we pay for them. So this is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. You can see that back here in 2007, it was 864 billion. And then we had the financial crisis in 2008, and it started adding to its balance sheet. What does that mean? That means it buys securities off the market. And what does it buy those securities with? It buys those securities with newly created dollars. It doesn't go into some reserve. There is no Federal Reserve. There's no reserves at the reserve. Okay? When the Fed buys securities, it does it with newly created money. Now, when it sells securities, all right, that money comes out of the commercial banking system and it just goes up in smoke. It destroys money. So it doesn't bother to keep like a separate account. Here's the dollars we created. We're going to take some now. No, because there's no reason to. The Federal Reserve exists to create money or destroy it in some cases. But most of the time, it's creating, right? So they told us in 2008, we got to do this once in a lifetime, they called it. And we're going to do this crazy thing called quantitative easing. What does that mean? We're going to buy a whole bunch of securities off the market. And up until this time, when the Fed's balance sheet was only 800 billion, they had always bought only US government bonds. And they started something new. We're going to buy mortgage-backed securities as well. So basically what they did there was they bailed out every bank that had gone long on mortgage-backed securities, which were now worthless because the foreclosure rate, went past the limit of where these things would be profitable. So basically they were worth zero at the time and probably still are, the ones they bought then. And they said, we're going to hold those securities for you, commercial banking system, and we're going to create the equivalent of what you bought them for in dollars and give you those dollars. So whenever the Fed's balance sheet increases, that means it's created new money that goes out into the economy. All right. So after the crisis, it was in the 800 billions. It goes up immediately to 2.2 trillion. Right, by when is this? December 2008. So they created over $1 trillion immediately. And then they kept on going. And they kept on going. And they kept on going until they got to 4.4 trillion in 2014. You could see there that they stopped increasing their balance sheet for several years after that. Now, back in 2008 here, when they said they were going to do it, they told us that this was a once in a lifetime thing, as I said. And they also said that they were going to normalize their balance sheet. Once the crisis is over, we're going to get back to normal. Now, it was always a little fuzzy. Do you mean you're going to get back to 800 billion? Maybe not, because the history of the Fed, the price always, or the balance sheet always rose, but nowhere near as drastically. But let's just say, draw a line from 1913 through 2008, roughly, and then in a number of years, we'll get back to wherever that line would have been. Well, of course, Jerome Powell, when he got to be Fed chairman, and he's always been, in relative terms, a hawk, he starts decreasing the balance sheet slowly. It peaks around 4.4. By the time we get to 2019, September 2019, he's got it down to 3.7. All right. Still like 4.5 times what it was in 2008. And that was the low. That's as far as it went, because if some of you can remember, we had a little crisis brewing in 19 before the COVID thing even happened. We had this whole thing happening with either the reverse repo market or the repo market. Hard to remember what it was. But in any case, right here, he starts printing money again. In other words, he starts buying securities. And I remember that he was putting money into that either reverse repo or repo market. I think it was the repo market, because the reverse repo comes in later. And then COVID hits. Okay. And who signs the spending bill that we don't have any money to pay for? Donald Trump, the CARES Act. And I've always said, lockdowns could not have happened without the CARES Act, because the states could not fund lockdowns. They couldn't pay people to stay home and do nothing. And so if Trump doesn't sign the CARES Act, there are no lockdowns. It can't occur. Okay. And really, there was no way to do it, whether Trump signed it or not, because there was no money. The government didn't have, it was already running deficits by this time, close to $1 trillion. And then it signs a bill to spend $2 trillion more. Where does it get it? Well, the Fed prints $2 trillion. It's at $4 trillion right here, right when COVID starts. And again, immediately it goes to the Fed prints $3 trillion by June 1st of that year. Okay. And then for technical reasons, the balance sheet goes down a little. And then again, it keeps on printing all the way till it peaks at 8.9 trillion. So it went from about 4 to 8.9. So about $5 trillion by 2022. Now, by this time, Biden's president. Okay. But $3 trillion of that happened in the first 6 months. And let's see, where does Trump? So Biden takes over in January of 2021. Okay, here's January 25th. That's right around Inauguration Day. We're at $7.4 trillion. So the Fed at that point has printed $3.4 trillion out of the eventual $5 trillion that they will print. So in other words, the vast majority of the dollars created to fund the COVID lockdown delusion that people could spend over a year producing nothing and go on consuming not even the same as before, but even more. That's where the money came from. 3.5 out of 5, whatever that is, 70% was printed while Trump was president to fund the ridiculous spending that he signed. And you remember, federal spending was under $4 trillion when Trump took over his first term. By the time, and Obama had taken it over at $3 trillion after the last, doubling by Bush. And he increased it to 3.9, which is terrible. But compared to Trump, who took it over at 3.9 and increased it to 4.5 before COVID even hit, and then to 6.5 by the time he's done. Every time a Republican's in, that's what happens. I know these numbers cold, okay? Clinton took over a government spending 1.4 trillion. He handed Bush a government spending 1.8 trillion. Bush took that $1.8 trillion government, turned it into a $3 trillion government. So he didn't quite double it, but he did his best. And then Obama takes over 3. He increases it to 3.9. Trump takes 3.9 and makes it 6.5. Okay, now, again, if it was a one-time crisis, we should have seen it go down under Biden, which actually it did for a couple of years. But the net on Biden was he takes over a $6.5 trillion government and he hands to Trump for Trump's second term a 6.9 trillion. So it was going up about the same as it was under Obama during Biden. Now Trump has taken over 6.9. Just the 500 billion in additional military spending that he wants to do would increase federal spending more than it increased in 4 years under Biden. Okay. So I think he's going to come in at 7.3 if he doesn't get that military spending. If he does, it's going to be even higher. But let's say he doesn't, and they only spend $1 trillion on the military in his second year. I think he's going to hit 7.3. So in other words, in 2 years, Trump will have increased spending as much as Biden did in 4 years. But again, at the end of the day, what causes prices to go up is how much money is created, nothing more. And that's why this chart somewhat lines up with this chart, which is prices going up in response to all that money the Fed created. Now, the Fed stopped creating new money, and when prices adjusted to the new amount of money and credit that was available, and there's another chart called M2, and that's what's actually out there in the economy, and it's even higher because commercial banks can then create money themselves on top of what the Fed created. We won't get into that, but it's a higher number, and it's at an all-time high right now. But in any case, the Fed stopped creating new money, and prices adjusted, and they stopped going up as fast. They didn't start dropping. So right here, the prices were increasing 9.1% in June of 2022, okay, per year. And then over the course of that year and into the next, so for the next year, the rate at which prices were increasing dropped precipitously from 9% to 3%. Now, that means they're still going up, okay? They're just not going up as fast. And as you can see, during the rest of Biden's presidency, they continue to trend. The rate of inflation, the rate of price increases keeps trending down. And this is September 2024. It's at 2.4%. That means prices are going up in September of 2024, 2.4% per year. Then it increases a little bit. Okay, and then here's about where Trump takes over, and the rate's 3.0%, so a little bit higher. And then it goes down to 2.3% by April of 2025. And as I said before, of course, 3 months into Trump's presidency, nothing he could have been doing, even if he was the one that was affecting this CPI rate, could have occurred by then. But as you can see, after April 2025, when the rate bottomed, it started going up again. And by September of last year, it was back up to 3. All right. So if Trump was doing something, that's his, again, what we can see is that it's somewhat leveled off. All right. It hasn't, price increases have now kind of leveled off between 2.5 and 3, which is way above the Fed's target rate. Now, the whole idea that the Fed has a target rate of prices always going up 2% is already a problem. So, I mean, that's just stealing. I mean, that's taking money from every person who's holding dollars and giving it to whoever this money goes to. Now, it usually goes out in the form of loans. But those loans are used to acquire assets, and it's the investment class that gets the benefit of that inflation, which is why they created the Fed in the first place. Okay. And why the gold standard is so vilified. They don't want some objective standard, keeping score. They love that slow trickle of wealth from you to them. And that's what the Fed is all about. It always has been. So again, a long explanation, but Trump's claim that prices are plummeting is clearly delusional. All right. I've got my cursor on the line. This is where that red line's got to be below this gray line for prices to be decreasing at all. They're just going up slower than they were at the peak of the COVID inflation, but they're not going down any slower they're not increasing any more slowly than they were the last year or so of Biden's term. It's been kind of on this right here. All right, so that's just a lie, right? I'm sure somebody in his administration told him he could say that because of maybe this little jog down, or maybe the one actually look. So it peaked in 2025 or September 2025 at 3, and right now we're in one of these down swoops. So he could say that the CPI is going down, but he turned that into prices are plummeting. No, they're still going up. They're going up 2.4% per year. Okay. So it's just nonsense. And it really has nothing to do with him anyway. It has to do with these guys, the Fed. But of course, again, presidents, by signing spending that they don't have the taxes to pay for, that's why the Fed prints some of the money that they print, not all. Okay. So what was the other claim? He keeps talking about all the jobs that are being created. So I just thought we could look at the unemployment rate. All right. So this is unemployment, and obviously close everything down. It goes way up in 2020, and then it quickly plummets back down. Of course, Trump was taking credit for this while it was coming down in 2020. And then, of course, it's all fake once Biden takes over right around here where it keeps going down. And all this is people going back to work after being told they're not allowed to go to work. Again, anybody who buys this stuff. So then what happens then? All right. So unemployment continues to go down until it looks like it bottoms in April of 2023 at a rate of 3.4%. Biden is still president. Okay. You can see the years at the bottom there. And then what happens from there? Well, it starts going back up again. So once everybody goes back to work, and I think I'd make the argument, and the ill effects of what we did, we being Washington and most of the American public that went along with this, start to be felt, and the malinvestment that happens when the Fed does this kind of thing, because what happens is there's so much money that the real effect of inflation is not just rising prices, but all kinds of investment flows to places it shouldn't. That's why we get the crash after. Well, it looks like we're on our way there because unemployment since 2023 has been on a pretty steady rise. Okay. And it's at 4.5% in November of 2025, the highest it's been since COVID, since, everybody was forced not to work. And now it's come down in January of 2026 to 4.3. Now, when Biden left office, it was 4.0. So unemployment is higher. That's the fact. And again, I'm not saying it's because of Trump. I'm just saying that obviously nothing Trump has done has made unemployment lower. This doesn't lie, right? It's right there in black, red, and white. So that was a complete He's deluded. He probably believes it too. He's got people around him that kind of fudge the numbers however they want to. I'm sure they'd come up with some basis for everything he throws out. And we'll talk about this last one. But again, here you can see unemployment is going up. It's been going up since he's been president. It's been going up since it bottomed in April of 2023 when Biden was still president. It started going up when Biden was president. It kept going up right through Trump. If I took these years away down here, and if it wasn't for the COVID thing, you wouldn't be able to tell when the new president took over. Okay? And that's the case for a lot of things. All right? It's the case for manufacturing output. Like I've done that before where I've said, okay, here's the chart without the years. Show me where these terrible trade deals came in on this chart. And of course, nobody can because they had no effect on manufacturing output. But I digress. So, okay. So delusion number 2, that they're creating all these jobs and all these people are going back to work. And I should say, the real discerning people will say, well, wait a minute. The unemployment number is divided. It's a function of the civilian labor force participation rate. So you remember when unemployment was going down during Obama and people were saying, well, that's only because you're not counting as many people who aren't working. And that's true. Now, some of those people are retired, but let's look at that chart real fast. All right. So back in 2007, 66% of the adult public was working. All right. And that, I don't have numbers before that. It used to be higher even than that. And then that's been on a steady decline since then. We had here's the recession from the financial crisis. That's what that gray bar is. Quite a long one compared to the COVID recession, as you can see. But the percentage of the population that's working has steadily gone down. And then it did level off here, I guess you'd say, starting in April of 2016, going through 17, 18, and it ticked up a little in 19 to 63.3%. And then you notice it starts to go down again. And there's a little spot here, it's hard to see, where it's going down right in that 2019 area, where late 2019, where I said we were starting to have a recession. And then COVID came in and a lot of people say covered it up. But then we get this plunge. Percentage of the workforce working goes down to 60%, along with that high unemployment number. And then it starts rebounding. Again, people coming back to work. Here's just February 2021, and it keeps going up. All right, so that's the bottom here is right around where Biden takes over. So it goes back up, and then while Trump's still president, it goes down again in December of 2020, and it bottoms in February of 2021, and then all during Biden's presidency, it goes up. And it peaks in November 2023 at 62.8%. Now you can see still way below here. Okay. It hasn't gotten back to pre-COVID, but it peaks at 62.8%. Is that because of Biden? Well, I don't know, because then it starts going down again. All right. And let's see, November 2024. So right in between where my cursor is, Trump gets elected and then takes over. This is May 2025, where it's at 62.6%, and then it goes down to 62.2. And as of December 2025, it was at 62.4, below the peak under Biden. But again, I guess where I'm going is these numbers have nothing to do with who's president. All right. Nothing that, I mean, we now have a smaller percentage of the adult population working than any time in American history. A lot of that has to do with the baby boomers retiring, okay? And some of it has to do with people that gave up looking for work, but it's lower than it was. Nothing Trump has done has raised that. I would argue, even though the number went up slightly, nothing Biden did raise that either. It is a long-term demographic trend. And again, unemployment is going up, even though the labor force participation rate hasn't really changed that much since about 2022. It's right in this range. Okay. So, I mean, really nothing concrete that these people say in these State of the Union addresses is true. It's just a chance for, again, it's the spectacle, the clapping, the not clapping. I mean, it really seems like it's gotten very childish, as has the American public. So we'll see. I mean, it seems like we're overdue for something like this, 2008, right? Because we did this and we haven't paid for it yet, other than in higher prices. So one thing I'll just say is, like, prices are never going back down. I mean, anyone who's been around, who's older than, 20, knows prices never go back down. They just stop going up as fast. All right. And we didn't get the huge CPI hit. We actually got deflation after the big money printing in 2008. And I would argue that's because we were in the teeth of the Chinese explosion of, cheap, affordable stuff that they shipped to us to prevent us from, feeling the pain we should have felt when we printed all this money from 800 to 4.4 trillion. Okay, this time around, China's more mature now. Under Xi, they're having more problems because he's less free market. That's an overgeneralization, but it's true. So we felt this one, and it was even worse. I mean, you can see how steep it was. That's why prices went up. That's it. That's the only reason. And it was exacerbated, of course, by nobody producing anything while we printed all this money and just spending it. I mean, that's what we're paying for. You don't think you could just have, like, there's a room in the basement with a bunch of stuff in it where we can just buy it with no money without producing anything. You had tens of millions of people producing nothing and went on spending. Well, if you're not going to get that money from taxes, this is where you get it, from printing. And that's why prices are higher now. That's why they're still going up, because even though the Fed has actually reduced its balance sheet quite a bit, it's still nowhere near. It's now in the 6.5 trillion range. Okay, still 2 trillion higher than it was in 2020. So there's just a lot more dollars floating around and availability to borrow, right? And that's why prices go up. That's it. Simple. We're paying for the delusional lockdowns, and we're going to pay for them for the rest of rest of my life. Maybe not yours if you're young. There'll be some other crisis you'll be paying for that way with higher prices. So, yeah, I just thought again, I wanted to turn this into a fact checking thing, because usually these fact checks are, the people performing them from like CNN or NBC or whatever. I mean, their principles are not that much different from Trump. So they have to go in and talk about stuff that doesn't matter. Oh, he said this, actually, whatever. So, I mean, what I want to point out is, the big things, the things that really make your life different. Nothing either president has done, any president has ever made them better. They never do. The best a president can do is do less damage than the average president. That's, like Reagan and Carter probably did less damage. than any of the presidents since then. Okay. And I actually group Carter and Reagan together. Everybody talks like there was this big change when Reagan came in. I like conservatives like to say that, but really the deregulation period, which is not the right word, it should be de-Sovietization period. Like the backing off slightly of the New Deal, getting, having the airlines not run by a Soviet Politburo anymore. That all happened under Carter, by the way. He deregulated the airlines. Ted Kennedy wrote the bill. Okay. So by the time Reagan got in, most of the deregulation was over. And then he did a little bit too, especially with finance. And that's been a double-edged sword, by the way. Getting rid of the regulations is always good. But, you get rid of this one, but not that one to give your friends an advantage, whatever. So anyway, yeah. I don't know if you watched. I have a feeling like a small percentage of my audience watches the State of the Union. Probably not. I mean, because you're probably interested in politics and you feel like you should watch it to be somewhat informed. Well, as I've just shown you, you've been misinformed. And if we went over every number that Trump said, oh, the other one's the 18 trillion in new investment. I mean, I hope I don't. That one's hard to debunk because it's just really based on nothing. It's like, it was 1 trillion under Biden. It was 18 trillion under Trump in 1 year. And everybody knows that's not true. If that were true, you would have this ridiculous economic activity going on. The unemployment rate would not be going up. If 18 trillion in new investment came in, they would be they'd be hiring homeless people. They'd be so desperate for more help. Okay. And obviously that's not what's happening. So I think I'll leave it there. And again, I'm sure that the people who are partial to Trump will call me a liberal or a commie or whatever. And that's fine. I'll just say, like, this is the same with every president. These State of the Union addresses are just mostly pure fiction. They're quasi-religious. I wish we'd get rid of them. And if you elect me president, I'll go back to sending the message over. In fact, what I'll do is I'll post the message from one of our best presidents, Martin Van Buren. Okay, doesn't get enough credit. He's usually written off as a postage stamp president. Let me give you a little hint. All the postage stamp presidents are better than the ones you can remember. If you have no idea what the president did while they were in office, that was a good president. Okay. All the ones that you can remember that did something significant, well, that was never good. They either got us into a big war or expanded the power of the government exponentially. So like when they come out, the historians with their lists of best and worst presidents, you can just pretty much turn it over upside down. And whoever's at the bottom, that's probably number one. It's not perfect that way, but you're in the ballpark better. People like FDR should be at the bottom. Anyone who got us into a major war, they're down there. I don't care, who it is. Maybe the War of 1812 is debatable. Any war after that, you're at the bottom because we didn't have to fight it. And that includes the world wars. And of course, FDR, he's the worst. He got us in the biggest war and he destroyed the Constitution with the New Deal. So, I mean, I don't think anyone's ever going to touch him. So if someone tells you Obama or Biden or Trump were the worst presidents, no way do they hold a candle to FDR or even his cousin Teddy, who the conservatives like. He's another awful one. So they're all bad. They all do damage. And the only thing you should be asking yourself is, which one in my lifetime did the least damage? And that's the best president of your lifetime. So as always, please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this podcast and comment. I get like a dozen emails after every one of these from people, and I appreciate them. I wish you just post on the comments, like so other people could see what you're saying. And I guess that also helps the podcast rise. The engagement will help get it seen by other people. The YouTube version, it's out there. It's kind of depressing that like my podcast gets like 100 or more times as many downloads as the video. So I don't know. Maybe I'll just have a stand-in like that's better looking, and then I'll lip sync, have him lip sync, whatever. But go to the YouTube or subscribe to it here on Apple or whatever platform you use for podcasts. And lastly, please share it with a friend. And let's get some more people in here listening to and watching Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Thank you for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.